This is Wendy Halley, and you're listening to Lucid Cafe. Welcome back. Let me just start out by saying that if you told me that the last episode I released, the one I did with my lovely husband, John, where we discussed honesty and ethics, if you had told me that that would become the favorite episode of many Lucid Cafe listeners, I probably would have said, get the hell out. I think I need to incorporate cocktail hour into all future episodes. I've never gotten so much incredible feedback. Thank you for listening and for helping me spread the word about the podcast. Word of mouth is the best way to make a podcast successful. So, thank you for that. Today's episode is all about coincidences, a topic that I find fascinating. Not surprisingly, connecting with my guest, Dr. Bernard Beitman, started with a pretty good coincidence. So, this is what happened. Someone I know recently told me about his research on coincidences, and I was all over it. I ordered a copy of his book, which is called Connecting with Coincidence, and was thinking that it would be fun if I could maybe find a way to get him on the podcast. And the day that my copy of his book arrived, I received an email from the person who originally told me about him, saying that she was in communication with him and said that he'd be interested in coming on Lucid Cafe. And here we are. How about that? Bernard Beitman is the first psychiatrist since Carl Jung to systemize the study of coincidences. He developed the first valid scale to measure coincidence sensitivity and has written several coincidence articles for psychiatric annals. He's written or edited 16 professional books. He's a visiting professor at the University of Virginia. He attended Yale Medical School and completed a psychiatric residency at Stanford. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Coincidence, Bernie Beitman. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah, coincidence is one of those things I think we're all really fascinated by, and it encompasses a lot of my work. It comes up a lot. We were talking a little bit before we started recording. I was saying how I don't remember instances of it happening, specific instances of it happening when I'm doing psychotherapy, although I know it happens all the time. But where it stands out more is when I'm doing shamanic work with folks. And so I feel like my life is rife with these really sometimes super powerful coincidental experiences. So I was really excited that you were willing to come on the show and talk about this a little bit more, since you're the guy.
Well, thanks. When you say that, it's like true, because I've studied this more comprehensively than anyone else has, as far as I can tell. There are a lot of books about coincidences out there, and you've read my book, Connecting with Coincidence, which is my recent one. But I've done several research studies about coincidences, the frequency which they happen, the most common ones, the characteristics of people who tend to see lots of coincidences, some of the psychology behind coincidences, including biases. And most interesting is how to use them and how to explain them. Because I'm a therapist like you, and I try to be able to make some sense out of them for all of us chickens running around here on Earth, because they happen a lot. And that's what I needed to demonstrate at first by having a survey of people at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. You got 1,000 people answering a set of questions about which coincidences do you experience and how many of them do you have, how frequently do you have them. So we're able to drop the numbers of possible questions down to about 7 of them or 8 of them, and be able to then send these surveys out to see which coincidences are most common, more generally speaking. I have a website where, if any of your listeners want to take the survey, the Weird Coincidence Survey, or weird Coincidence Survey, is like a way to get some idea about their own coincidence sensitivity. There are people who take it and say, I'm very sensitive, but it doesn't fit for me. But when you do these things, they're not perfect. And with that, I was able to get some ideas of which were more common and led to more thinking about them based on which ones seem to be more common. And I've always tried to understand them, see how they work. So this is all a way of saying that I've studied them for quite a long time, starting with some of my early ones when I was 8 or 9 years old. And they've been with me a lot of my life. And because I wasn't much of a talker, my family's parents spoke German around the house a lot. And our brother and I just ate and played sports. And talking wasn't a big thing. So that's an advantage and a disadvantage, because the advantage was that I had to figure out things by watching and listening, and not listening to what happened around me. So I became more sensitized to what was around me and started piecing things together. If there's anything particularly that I think your listeners and other people would like to know, is that coincidences are not this weird thing. They happen a lot, and some of them are very strange, and that's what's fun about them. But coincidences are the way we figure out how reality works. Two things happen around the same time. How come?
That is the question. And I love that question. So, how come? Do you have any theories as to why coincidences even happen? That's just a light question for you.
Yes, I do. I have a friend of mine that kind of bothers me in the way she asks questions, because it's usually a yes or no question. And therapists tend to avoid not doing that, although sometimes it's a good thing to do. So my answer to your question is yes, I do.
Yes, you have some theories.
Yes, I do.
Would you care to share any of those?
Well, let me think about that.
Yeah, I fell into the yes/no trap there.
Well, I knew what you were asking. So when she does it, she's really asking yes or no, but she really wants it. She wants to know more too. But she does anyway. That happens all the time. Yeah, I know what you were asking. I mean, I've written a chapter in a new book I'm writing now called "On Explanation," and it's of coincidences, and it's probably right now about 60 or 80 pages long. So to go down that list right now would be a little boring for our listeners. But I can name some of them, and I'll do it fast. But I I think it's getting down to the coincidences themselves. Like, I'd like to know what kind of coincidences happen with you and your shamanistic practices. There are contexts that increase the likelihood of coincidences, and the context that I like to go for in a more general answer to your question is that coincidences are more likely to happen when we tear the web of ordinary reality. Then stuff comes in.
You're talking my language.
How is that your language?
Well, just because, I mean, since I started having these visionary experiences, and it was back in 98 when I had my first spontaneous one, I started to, at least, I don't know if understands the right word. It seems like a pretty definitive word, but understand, I guess, is the one I'll use. That the nature of reality is a lot more complicated than we might think it is. And so, because when I'm going into an altered state of consciousness to access this other place, this other reality, it's a window into a broader perspective of reality. And everything in that place is symbolic. So it's the dreaming. And to me, that's the seed of coincidences, like for the bigger ones anyway. And you talk about different categories of types of coincidences, which I'd like to talk to you a bit about. But yeah, the whole idea that reality, when you start accessing it from beyond just this objective physical reality and get into this more subjective, altered states, that things become a little more complicated and interesting.
Yeah. Row, row, row your boat Gently down the stream, merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And what coincidences help you see is what you've mentioned, is that there's a lot of symbols around us all the time. And the idea that you are me and I am you and we are we together. Where's that song come from? It's a Beatles song.
Yeah.
The Walrus, I think.
I think for them was LSD, maybe.
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was not about LSD. They swore about that. It was you come at it in very different ways. Psychedelics is one way, a spontaneous visionary experience, which then pulls you into it in some other ways. There are a lot of ways people get to it. I know a friend of mine just does it from reading certain phrases in books, just get him, spiritually elevated. There's different strokes for different folks. Let a thousand flowers bloom. All kinds of ways that people can get to realize what was implied in what you're talking about. You get outside of regular reality and look back at it and see it differently. If there's any particular one thing that you would ask me, what's the main takeaway, Dr. Beitman, from your study of coincidences? If you just happened to ask me that question today, then I would answer activation and practice of one's self-observer.
Okay.
What do you think of that?
I think that's intriguing. And I would be curious what your definition of
I'd be
self-observer
curious about
is.
yours first, because you're a therapist and you work with that. And if you're a shamanistic practitioner, which you are, you also work with that. So, I mean, I'll tell you mine, but I've been working on it. I'd like to hear how you think about this phrase, your self-observer.
All right. I would say the self-observer is, I think there are a couple of levels of them. So this is probably going to sound strange. I think there's one associated with our ego, our sense of self, who we think we are. And that's the part of us, to me, that's aware and is paying attention, hopefully, and looking at patterns and trying to understand them. And then there's another part of us, I believe we have a higher self, or what I would refer to as an oversoul, that is the ultimate observer. And from the indigenous perspective, you could say that that part of us is dreaming us into existence. So I am the dream of my oversoul, my Wendy aspect. So that's my off the cuff answer. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Oh, it does. I mean, it does. This oversoul idea is merging with ideas of our being in a computer simulation. Uh, there is a sense in all human beings, think about it, many people think about it, of some higher intelligence that has something to do with making us happen. And religions call it God. Secular spiritualists have different ideas about it, and there's different levels of what this simulation might have in it, what this various levels of how we're created or how we think about ourselves. And that oversoul one, we could get into it. It's a lot of speculation, but there is some work about us being in a simulation. It started with The Matrix, the 1999 movie.
Hmm.
And that's fun to talk about, but we don't know much yet. But the self-observer that's associated with our ego is what you were talking about earlier, looking at patterns. That's so much of the problem or issue or need. Because this friend of mine I was telling you about that does yes or no questions does not look at her own mind. When she does things that are like bothersome to me, and I try to say something to her about it, she apologizes or forgets about it and forgets about it. She doesn't stop to look at what might have happened. She says stuff like, I can't explain it, and lets it go. A person with an active interest, an active curiosity in their own mind would say, I wonder what made Bernie react like that. I wonder what it was in me that made me say that, because in a way he was right, and maybe he was overly sensitive too, which I was in some of the times.
Okay.
But she wasn't curious enough to look at her own mind and then into my mind.
So introspection.
Introspection. I don't use the word introspection. It's kind of a static word. It doesn't have a dynamic quality to it.
Okay. What would you use?
Activating your observing self.
Okay.
And the observing self is, but words are really important in all this. And introspection might work for you. Introspecting might work for you. I just haven't used that for a long time. I try to look for the least cumbersome language that I can find, and that's tricky sometimes. But anyway, that's a separate question. So what happens when you introspect or start looking at your own mind? You start seeing a landscape of patterns, and that's so crucial. The word patterns is the looking for patterns which are repeated. Patterns repeat. Coincidences are a big help in activating one's observing self or self-observer, because you have to compare a pattern in your own mind with a pattern that's external to you. So it's a recognition of a pattern in your own mind, recognition of a pattern externally, and then recognition of the similarity of both of them. And that's a kind of sophisticated form of pattern recognition. Human brain is made to recognize patterns.
But then there's also an emotional response to it too, that kind of sets it apart from when it's meaningful, as Carl Jung would say, a synchronistic event. It's a meaningful coincidence. Because you can have a coincidence, I think, for some people, they might see something as coincidental and they'll see the pattern there, but they won't see it as meaningful. They might write it off as they might rationalize it.
Well, you just told me earlier that you probably have a lot of coincidences during therapy sessions or around patients, but you can't remember any. Usually, right now anyway.
That's probably more a byproduct of menopause. My memory is shot.
Well, you remember them in your shamanistic work.
Yeah, because those have been sort of life-changing.
Well, I want to go to those because the place of emotion in coincidences is really important, and it's important to point that out. And one of the problems with all of this is the definition of the word meaning.
Okay.
What is the meaning of meaning? Is a kind of activates your observing self, because you have to look at a word meaning and then wonder about its meaning, and that's almost like a second level of self-observation. And I like that. It's meta. I'll call it. It's going meta twice.
Right.
And I think there's a self-observer and there's an observer of the self-observer. And then there's observer of the self-observer. And that's about as far as I can go. But those are meta ways of thinking about it. So what's the meaning of meaning in coincidences? The meaning of meaning in coincidences is probably 4 different meanings of meaning in coincidences.
Okay.
The first meaning is like finding a pattern, external and internal, that share a meaning. They mean the same thing, or meaning something the same thing. That's one. That's what the basic definition of a coincidence. The second is the emotion that goes with it. It's meaningful, is usually driven by some kind of feeling about the experience. And then another form of meaning is, what does it mean to me? What's usually about my future or about who I am. What does it mean to me personally? And the fourth meaning of meaning is like, how do you explain this? How do we explain how this happened? And that's another form of meaning. So those are 4 different meanings, and they're fun to describe because they take apart the key elements of a coincidence. These 4 meanings describe the key elements of a coincidence. But when you're talking about the emotional meaning, because Jung tried to say that, at least sometimes he tried to say, that coincidence had to have a numinous experience associated with them in order to be a synchronicity. Now, without talking about it too much, Jung was trying to get into this. He was embarrassed a little bit about the craziness of it, and published it kind of later in his life, his book on synchronicity. And he had a hodgepodge of definitions of the term. Sometimes synchronicity meant only coincidences that help people individuate, like help them. It's like psychotherapy through coincidences. Those are the only ones that counted. But then he defined coincidences in his synchronicity book to include telepathy and clairvoyance, and precognition, I think, was in there too. And some people do with that, as Jungians don't necessarily do that or include it. So the biggest confusion, I think, around the word synchronicity is that it's both a description of the coincidences, and synchronicity is also an explanation. So he used synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle, which meant something hard to understand. What do you mean acausal? Well, he meant probably, but there was a lot of speculation about it. Probably didn't mean cause in the usual sense. And even if you took apart Jungian thinking, Jung's thought about it, the activation of an archetype, the constellation of an archetype was the translation of the German. Constellating an archetype was associated with the creation of a coincidence, but it wasn't the cause. So it got to be kind of hard. They were coincidentally related. And I just realized that they were just coincidentally related. The archetype was activated, the coincidence happened. So there's a coincidence,
Nice.
but there wasn't a causal relationship. That's really funny. I hadn't thought about that.
Huh. All right. So then let me backtrack then where we were going before we went down that little rabbit hole. I think I was guilty of having a sort of broad spectrum perspective on coincidence until I read your book, and you had broken it down into there are different types of coincidences. I was wondering if you could just do kind of a brief overview of the different types.
Different types. Typology of coincidences. That's a chapter in this new book I'm writing, and it's not the way I broke them down in the book Connecting with Coincidence. So
you got new material?
Oh yeah, this is a kind of a different way of looking at it, because I wanted to answer this question because this is a kind of a new science. It's more than a science in the usual sense, but and new sciences start with description. What are you talking about? That's how botany and zoology get going. And put things in categories. You can organize them better. So that's what I've been doing and done with coincidences. The way I've broken them down now is that coincidences are made up of two primary elements. One is mind, that is events in the mind, and the other is objects, things in the environment. So the standard coincidence is I think of something and that person shows up, or I see it out there, or I think of a song and I hear it on the radio. So there's a thought connected with a thing, an object out there that can be observable by other people. Those two elements, mind and object, can be composed three different categories, three major overview categories. Mind thing, which I just mentioned, mind where two minds are thinking about the same thing. And my example of that is happened when I was 31 years old, and I was severely choking on something in my throat, and I couldn't get it out of my throat. It was 11 p.m. in San Francisco, and 1972, 1973. And the next day I found out that at 2 a.m. in Wilmington, Delaware, which was 11 p.m. in San Francisco time, my father was dying, choking on his own blood. He bled into his throat. It's the sort of thing that catches your attention. As Freud has mentioned, the death of one's father for a son is a suggestion that your son's going to die too. I mean, it's pretty clear.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think for women, it's the mother that'll do that for the same kind of reason.
Yep.
You're going to be dead. Look what happened to your father. So I remembered that. I mean, remembered for a lot of reasons. It was like, what was that? I'm choking. I never choked like that before. He's dying, choking. I mean, what's that?
Were you choking on anything, or was it just a sensation of choking?
Sensation of choking.
Which makes it even more interesting, doesn't it?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
So that's mind to mind.
That's mind to mind. And just to add to that, the next day, or the day in Wilmington, was February 27th, which was my birthday. So my father died on my birthday, which people have to do. It's 1 out of 365 is going to happen.
Right.
But that added to the low probability of that event happening and made it be, remember me, remember me, remember me. Okay, I've written a song about this about you, and this thing with it. I co-wrote it with a friend of mine. So I recorded it. I mean, okay, I'm remembering. It's in a book. Okay, okay, Pop. Okay, that's what I did.
Got it. Yeah.
So that's the mind one. And I call that simulpathy.
Okay, and that's a powerful example.
And that questionnaire I was telling you about, people said that happens to them sometimes. It's not uncommon.
You're reminding me of tomorrow happens to be the anniversary of my mother's death. She died 30 years ago on April 3rd. She was very young. She was 45 at that time with cancer. She was in the hospital. And the afternoon of April 3rd, I was coming home from class. I was at the University of Arizona. My plan when I left class was to go home, take a shower, then go to the hospital. And instead, because the hospital was on the way to the house, and I got to the hospital and I pulled in a completely different entrance than I usually go. I just did it. I just turned the turn signal on and went in the hospital, and I had missed her by 15 minutes. She died 15 minutes before my arrival there. Would that be an example of kind of that mind to mind?
There are so many examples of the kids getting the message somehow, or their loved one getting it. Sometimes they're crisis apparitions. Jung described many descriptions where your mother shows up in your bedroom saying, "I'm okay, I'm dying," and the kid sees that and knows that, or the loved person sees that. Mine was an experience of a physical experience. That's not uncommon.
Right.
And then there's the mental one, which is kind of what happened to you. And what you described is like, I just felt like doing it. Something made me do it. I had this feeling to just turn in here. I don't know what made me do it. That is such a common trigger of coincidences. It gets you to learn how to follow your own intuition, to hone your own intuition, to learn to trust it. Because in that situation, you got a message and you did the right thing.
Yeah, that was intense. I mean, I hadn't even thought of that until we were having this conversation.
That's why we do this.
That's exactly why we do this.
I'm a trigger. I'm a trigger. That's why they call me
Yeah.
Dr. Coincidence. I I spread the fairy dust of coincidence awareness around. So anyway, the third one is is object. The third class is object.
Okay.
And object is like seeing a series of the same thing. Like it's not so much in your mind, it's seeing two things or more of the same thing, like a series of eagles. I know somebody who sees monkeys all in various images all the time, and she's maybe seen 1,000. She keeps a record of all the monkeys she's seen. Sometimes it's like somebody who's got an alcohol problem seeing 5 different examples of somebody going to AA, or somebody telling her to go to AA if she needs treatment. So those are all objective ones that any person can see. So mind thing, mind object, mind, and object are the 3 general categories.
I like those. They're very simple to understand and make sense.
Good.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is the tendency for people to look for coincidences where there aren't any, to kind of like force a coincidence. I've seen that a lot in my counseling work where people are looking for meaning. It seems to come from a place of maybe not trusting that things will unfold the way they need to. There's a sense of desperation. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you ever noticed that?
There's a chapter in my new book called Problematic Coincidences, of which that is one. There's a term that people who think coincidences aren't worth paying attention to called apophenia, a term that means looking for patterns that aren't there. And I coined a term for people who refuse to see coincidences as cryptomania. It's hidden, but they don't want to see it. It's hidden to them. So they like to say, "Well, you make it up." Well, you forget about them. This type 1 and type 2 error in science is another way that people understand that. So that's not uncommon. And one of the versions of that is that there are fundamentalist religious leaders and leaders of charismatic or fundamentalist social movements who want to find ways to blame subgroups that they don't like for or criticize subgroups they don't like. So, for example, Jerry Falwell, now deceased minister from Virginia, my state, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, said it was all because of the sins of the gays in New Orleans. Same thing was said of floods in Manhattan by fundamentalist people from all kinds of religions, including Judaism, including rabbis. So there's a coincidence of a tragedy and destruction, and with the belief system of certain religious leaders that then becomes a coincidence for them that they can capitalize on. So they're making one up right there, and that's a general thing where people want to make a coincidence to validate some kind of belief that they have.
No, so confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's a confirmation bias. This is worse. It's making them up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
To confirm a bias. I mean, confirmation bias is more like, I want to believe this is really important, and it confirms that I'm on the right trail. I want to be on the right trail. So maybe it's something like, maybe it is confirmation bias, but to me, it's kind of reaching more further than what I.
Well, it's to, I guess, support the agenda.
Yes, to support the agenda. And confirmation bias is in that direct, support my agenda, to be feeling that I'm doing on the right path. I can see how that, but to me.
Well, I'm wondering if maybe his followers, there would be confirmation bias there.
Oh, yes. But because that's confirming their belief by making this coincidence happen.
Yeah.
Okay, confirmation bias. That's good. That's good.
All right. So, wondering if we could talk a little bit about positive expectations.
Well, if we talk about the factors that increase coincidences, one of them is believing they're there.
So just believing that they exist.
Yeah, and that they're worth paying attention to.
All right.
That's a form of positive expectation, I would say, because a lot of people don't think they're worth paying attention to generally. So what I'm trying to do is give categories of, like in therapy, categories within therapy, so that therapists can remember their coincidences. Is it a form of countertransference and transference sometimes? So that positive expectation, one of the best ways to increase coincidences is to believe that they're going to happen. And positive expectations is correlated with luckiness. People who are lucky are the ones who expect to be lucky. It's
so the belief system kind of sets it up.
Belief system sets so much up. We talk about seeing is believing, but so much is believing is seeing.
All right. I just had to digest that for a second.
Well, if you haven't heard it before, you have to digest it, because I've run it around a number of times. So my believing is seeing. There's a person's expectations influence a lot of experience. One of my favorite phrases from George Kelly, a not very well known psychologist from Ohio State: a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the way she anticipates events. Expectation influences experience is a shorter way of saying it.
Yeah, no, it is less wordy too.
Less wordy.
All right. So what are some other ways that people can increase coincidence in their life?
They could look around right now, because the web of ordinary reality is being torn for everybody in the world right now, or most everybody. And the likelihood of more coincidences happening is increased under conditions like this. So I suggest your audience pay attention to coincidence even more now. And how are they going to do it if they're not running around in the world? Well, they're going to be on the internet. And sometimes I think we're nodes in the internet's connectivity, because there are so many coincidences involving the internet these days, and there was about the radio and TV stuff before. So start looking for coincidences, because they happen when There's high emotion, which we got plenty of right now.
Yep.
When there's need, which is like, what is going on? Is it ever going to be over? And major transition. So transition, need, and high emotion are all correlated with an increase in coincidences.
So now that we're all kind of on lockdown in this very heightened time, the pandemic time, it's like ripe for coincidental
That's the
experiences.
theory. That's my observation. Yep.
Okay. I'm really intrigued by the idea of positive expectations.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm trying to think about some of the bigger coincidences that have happened in my life. And if I actually, I don't know if I had a conscious expectation. At least it wasn't, I think it's interesting how they play out because it's not like you have the desire and then you just sit there and wait for the event, the coincidence to happen. It's sort of like, is it kind of like a seed planting in your psyche? So I'm thinking about I was working full time for the state of Vermont as a psychotherapist, doing short term counseling work through an employee assistance program. And I had a part time shamanic healing practice that was way under the radar, just word of mouth only. It pretty much still is, except if you're listening to this, it's not under the radar, I guess. And I was feeling antsy. I was feeling like I wanted something more. I love doing psychotherapy. I've been doing it for a really long time. And I was craving something more and I didn't quite know what that looked like or what that meant. And so this is what happened. It was in 2014. I was having dinner with my husband in our little family room, and when we would eat, we had this tradition of he would sit in a certain chair, I would sit in a certain chair, and our dogs would be hanging out while we ate, waiting patiently for us to give them a treat afterwards. And I'm sitting down to eat, and we have this old house. It was built in the original part was built in 1840. I'm sitting in one of the chairs that we inherited from the previous owner, and it's an antique chair, and the bottom of it was the upholstery was ripped out underneath a little bit. And so I'm sitting in this chair and I'm eating, and all of a sudden I hear this metallic sound, this vibrational sound. And I'm like, what the hell is that? And I stood up because I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and it stopped. I'm like, okay, maybe it was just my imagination. I sit back down, start eating again, and the sound comes back. And then all my dogs, boom, they come up and they're surrounding me. And I'm thinking, what is going on? It's the strangest sound. It's like a metallic vibration. So I put my dish down and I'm listening and I hear it's coming from the chair. Now we're pulling the chair out of the corner and we're turning it over and looking inside the chair where the little rip is. And you see all the springs and the sound is coming from inside of the chair. And so we get a flashlight, look inside of there, and there's a bat inside my chair. Well, immediately my shamanic radar goes up, a bat. This is important. So we take the chair outside, and I get a long wooden spoon and carefully kind of get the bat out of because it was stuck in there. It was scared. Cutest little thing, and pull it out, and then put it on the driveway, and it kind of crawled out on its little wing elbows off the driveway and then flew away. Everything in me it felt very personal because to me, the bat, it's very symbolic of death and rebirth. So I was like, all right, it's time to fasten my seatbelts. Something's going to happen, something big. I just didn't know what. And then probably the weekend after that, I was watching an interview on a subscription website I belong to, just kind of a random interview. It was with an inventor of a technology that uses light and sound to create a relaxed state in order to put the body into self-healing mode. And I had such a wicked strong reaction to this interview and the data that he had collected about how this impacted people and their health. When I have that kind of reaction, which is pretty rare in my life, I pay attention. So within 48 hours of watching that interview, I had found the closest place where I could try this technology, and which was Colorado, and I'm in Vermont. And I had a flight booked and a session scheduled, and went out there, tried it, and had such a profound experience that I was working on a business plan on the plane ride home. And then exactly a year later, it was actually the same week that I was trying the technology the year before was the week I opened this wellness center. And so that whole bad experience to me was setting me up. Anyone else, like my husband would have said, "No, it's just a strange coincidence. There's no meaning there." But I had a whole bunch of meaning and hair standing on end kind of meaning. Yeah, and so life changed dramatically after that, and it was a death and rebirth of my work life. I still do counseling, but it's a small portion of my work now. So there's that story.
It's quite emotional for you. I can see that.
Yeah, it was really really meaningful, and that's just one of many many stories that I won't bore you with, but yeah, just this idea of having an expectation, like you were saying, as planting that seed of I want something to change in my career, and then those things unfolded afterwards.
Did you have that I want something to change in my career before you heard the bat?
Mhm.
Okay, well, that wasn't so clear to me when listening to you.
Oh, okay.
Maybe you said it, but I didn't get it. But that you had a general expectation, a hope, or desire for a change,
Yeah, I just didn't know what it was gonna look like. I had no idea, but I had been open to the idea of what could be next.
and then uh, the symbolism, because of your shamanic experiences, was able to penetrate through to you and to suggest to you that this was a beyond ordinary reality event,
Yeah.
that the bat had symbolic meaning for you, which was transformation. So then you became alert for looking for the transformative method, and you just happened again to find something that seemed to fit your expectation without knowing that it was that. You knew it when you saw it,
Right.
and that popped you into Colorado, and now you're in the wellness center. That's a good story.
Thanks. Yeah. I love stuff like that. And really, what are the odds that a bat would be in your chair?
In your belfry, maybe, but not in your chair.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've never had a bat in our house before that and since. That was,
Right.
and it's just such an odd place for a bat to show up.
Very odd place for a bat to show up.
Yeah.
Uh,
I know.
was it a rocking chair?
No, no. It was just an old antique upholstered chair.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's so cool. And we can end the story with, like, my nickname sometimes is Batman. Beitman sounds like it.
Oh, okay.
That's so the person who does the monkey things calls me Batman, and other people have too. So in Hebrew, the vowels don't matter; it's just the consonants. In the old Hebrew, not now. And the vowels, if you have a B and a T, it doesn't matter what's in between. That means the words are related to each other, and so Batman and Beitman are related in that kind of way of thinking. So I get a kick out of hearing about bats like that. So that story is meaningful to me just for that. But having a bat in the chair. Well, what's important there for our listeners is your view of reality, which is that you could see that and see it as a shamanic vision materialized, so that you could then pop up into the life is but a dream way of thinking and say, this is a message from the dream. And I'm going to pay attention to this dream message and see where it leads me.
Exactly.
And if there, dreams are a lot of fun, but for me, more ambiguous than reality. This one out here, and so being able to think like life is but a dream, but think of it, the living dream that we're living in dream as a dream. It's a little more concrete, and
Yeah, that's how I roll. That perspective has opened the door for a lot more
yeah,
coincidental
yeah,
experiences because I'm looking at it that
yeah,
way. Everything is
yeah,
symbolic.
yeah, yeah. And that's another message of coincidence. Is just that.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm aware of the time and we did go a little bit longer than we had planned, so I apologize for that, but I'm really appreciative of you coming on the show
You're welcome.
and having a very intriguing conversation.
You're welcome, and I'm glad we went over because your story is important. It's not just my stories that it's important. It's hard for me to get that across sometimes when I'm doing an interview, but it's not just about me. It's about the interviewer too. I am you, you are me. It's like we're learning from each other in this sort of thing. And I know I don't know a lot of stuff, and I keep trying to figure it out. I'm curious, and so being able to hear your story is really important to me.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, I got a million of them, but again, maybe not a million, but quite a few. But this has been wonderful. Maybe at some point when your new book comes out, you can come back on the show and you can talk more about that. But how can people find you?
If they remember the phrase "connecting with coincidence," just connecting with coincidence. Put "connecting with coincidence" in your web browser, and you'll find my.
You'll find Batman.
You'll find Batman. You'll find Batman flying all over the place, and that'll be in Psychology Today blog. I have my book, my radio show, my website are all gettable too by putting "connecting with coincidence" in your web browser.
And I will put a link to your website and your podcast in the show notes.
And my book, I hope.
And your book. Well, yeah. I mean, they can find it on your website, right?
Yeah, but I like to have a separate link for it.
Okay, I'll put that link there as well.
Good.
All right, sir. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was fun.
So now I can say I had Batman on my podcast. If you enjoyed my Bat story, Bernie has graciously invited me on his podcast in early July of 2020, and I suspect I'll be telling more stories from my shamanic travels, which are rife with crazy coincidences and synchronicities. All of Bernie's links can be found in the show notes. Big thank you to Dr. Beitman for coming on the show, and thank you for listening. Until next time, may your days be filled with mind-blowing coincidences.